For 25 years, nobody questioned why the mall janitor worked alone, why he knew every exit, every camera blind spot, every structural weakness. The terrorists were about to find out why. Welcome to Faces Behind Stories. Before we begin this powerful story of hidden heroism and split-second courage, tell me in the comments from which city are you watching this video today. And if you believe stories like this deserve to be heard, hit that subscribe button and help us honor the silent guardians among us. Westfield Shopping Center stretched across 40 acres of suburban America like a monument to consumer culture. 3 levels, 200 stores, and an average daily foot traffic of 15,000 people. It was the kind of place where teenagers hung out after school, families spent their weekends, and retirees walked for exercise before the stores opened. For 25 years, Frank Morrison had been part of the landscape, not as a shopper or a store owner, but as the night shift custodian who arrived at 10 p.m. when the last customers were leaving and worked until 6 a.m. when the first employees started filtering in. At 68, he was the kind of man who blended into the background. Average height, gray hair, work clothes that had seen better days, and a quiet demeanor that made him practically invisible to the thousands of people who passed him every day. Most of the mall employees knew Frank by sight, if not by name. He'd been there longer than almost anyone, a constant presence who kept the place clean and functional. Store managers appreciated his reliability, security guards respected his work ethic, and the few people who bothered to engage him in conversation found him polite but reserved. "Morning, Frank," they'd say as they passed his custodial cart in the early hours. "Morning," he'd reply with a slight nod, then return to his work. But there were things about Frank Morrison that didn't quite add up if you knew what to look for. He worked alone by choice, even though the mall's size would have justified a crew of 4 or 5. He knew the building's blueprints better than the architects who'd designed it, could navigate the service corridors and mechanical spaces in complete darkness, and had an uncanny ability to spot potential security vulnerabilities before they became problems. His custodial cart was always positioned near emergency exits, and he had a habit of checking doors that were supposed to be locked, testing alarms that were supposed to be functional. The security guards had noticed his patterns over the years. Frank never used the main entrances during his shifts, preferring to slip in through loading docks and service areas. He could move through the mall's labyrinthine back passages like a ghost, appearing and disappearing without making a sound. And sometimes, late at night, they'd catch him on the security monitors standing perfectly still in empty corridors, head tilted slightly as if listening for something no one else could hear. "Guy's been here since before I was born," joked Marcus, the head of mall security, a former police officer who'd taken the job after 20 years on the force. "Sometimes I think he knows this place better than his own apartment." What Marcus didn't know, what nobody knew, was that Frank Morrison had spent 12 years as a Force Reconnaissance Marine, specializing in deep reconnaissance and direct action missions. 3 tours in Iraq, 2 in Afghanistan, countless classified operations in places that didn't officially exist on military maps. He'd been the guy they sent in first, alone, to scout enemy positions and eliminate high-value targets before the main force arrived. Frank had left the Marines in 2008 with a chest full of medals he'd never displayed, a disability pension for shrapnel wounds that still ached on rainy days, and skills he'd hoped never to use again. All he'd wanted was a quiet job, a steady paycheck, and the peace that came with knowing exactly where every potential threat could come from. The custodial position had been perfect. Night shifts meant fewer people to interact with. The work was physical but not demanding. And the building itself, with its multiple levels, complex layout, and numerous entry points, reminded him just enough of the compounds he'd learned to navigate in hostile territory to keep his tactical instincts sharp without triggering the nightmares that still visited him occasionally. For 25 years, Frank had found the peace he'd been looking for. The mall was his territory, and he protected it with the same quiet professionalism he'd once brought to military operations. Nothing happened in his building without his knowledge. No suspicious activity went unnoticed. No potential threat went unassessed. But on a Saturday afternoon in November, Frank's 2 worlds collided in the most violent way possible. It was 2:15 p.m. when they entered. Frank was in the second-level storage area, restocking supplies and monitoring the weekend crowd through the security feed he'd rigged to his portable radio. The mall was busy but not packed, typical for a Saturday afternoon in November, with early Christmas shoppers starting to venture out and families killing time between kids' activities. Frank noticed them immediately on the monitor. 6 men, mid-20s to early 30s, entering through different entrances but moving with coordinated precision. They wore long coats despite the mild weather, walked with military bearing, and kept their heads down to avoid the security cameras. Most importantly, they all carried large duffel bags that they held with the careful balance of people carrying something heavy and fragile. Professional, coordinated, armed. Frank's blood went cold as he watched them take positions throughout the mall. 2 headed for the main atrium, 2 more toward the food court, and 2 positioned themselves near the primary exits. Classic terrorist formation: control the crowd, block the escape routes, maximize psychological impact. He'd seen this pattern before, in briefings about Mumbai, in training scenarios, in the nightmares that sometimes woke him in a cold sweat. But this wasn't a briefing or a training exercise. This was happening in his mall, to his people, on his watch. Frank reached for his radio to call security, then stopped. Marcus was a good man, but he was an ex-cop, not a combat veteran. The mall's security team was trained for shoplifters and medical emergencies, not terrorist attacks. By the time they understood what they were facing and called for backup, it would be too late. The first gunshots rang out at 2:18 p.m. Automatic weapons fire echoed through the mall like thunder, followed immediately by screaming and the sound of people running. Frank watched on his monitor as shoppers scattered in panic, some trying to escape, others diving for cover behind store counters and planters. One of the terrorists, a tall man with a beard, had positioned himself in the main atrium and was firing controlled bursts into the air, herding the crowd toward the center of the mall where his partners could control them. Another had taken position near the GameStop, using his weapon to keep families with children from reaching the nearest exit. Frank counted the civilians in his head as he watched the monitors, roughly 300 people, including at least 40 children. The terrorists weren't shooting to kill, yet. They were establishing control, creating a hostage situation, buying time for whatever their real objective was. But Frank knew how these things ended. He'd studied enough terrorist attacks to understand the psychology. The longer the situation dragged on, the higher the chance of mass casualties. These men hadn't come to negotiate. They'd come to make a statement, and that statement would be written in blood. Time to move. Frank opened the security locker he'd installed in the storage room 15 years earlier, disguised as a cleaning supply cabinet. Inside was equipment he'd hoped never to need: tactical knife, flashbang grenades, flexible restraints, and a small arsenal of improvised weapons he'd crafted from maintenance supplies over the years. No firearms, he'd promised himself he was done with killing, but enough hardware to level the playing field against conventionally armed opponents. As he geared up, Frank's mind shifted into a mode he thought he'd left behind. Threat assessment, tactical options, rules of engagement. The quiet custodian was disappearing, replaced by the Force Recon Marine who'd spent 12 years hunting terrorists in their own backyard. 6 targets, unknown explosive devices, 300 civilians, multiple levels and escape routes, complex sight lines and potential ambush points. It was exactly the kind of mission he'd trained for his entire military career. Frank slipped into the service corridors that honeycombed the mall's infrastructure, moving through passages that were invisible to the general public, but as familiar to him as his own apartment. 25 years of working alone had taught him every inch of this building, every hidden entrance, every structural weakness that could be exploited. The first terrorist never saw him coming. The man was positioned near the Spencers, using his rifle to keep a group of teenagers pinned behind a jewelry kiosk. Frank emerged from a maintenance hatch directly behind him, moving with the fluid silence that had kept him alive in a dozen countries. The tactical knife found the space between the man's ribs before he could turn around, and Frank was already moving to his next target before the body hit the ground. 1 down, 5 to go. The second target was more alert, positioned in an elevated position near the food court where he could observe multiple approach routes. But Frank had spent years learning to move through hostile territory without being detected, and the mall's complex architecture provided plenty of concealment. A careful approach through the kitchen areas of the closed restaurants put him within striking distance, and another silent takedown eliminated the second threat. 2 down, 4 to go. But the remaining terrorists were starting to notice that their communications had gone quiet. Frank heard urgent Arabic over the radio he'd taken from the first target, voices demanding status reports that would never come. The leader, the tall man with the beard, was getting suspicious. He ordered his remaining men to converge on the main atrium, where they could maintain visual contact with each other and better control the hostages. Frank watched from the second-level balcony as the terrorists forced nearly 200 terrified civilians into a tight group near the center fountain. Children were crying, mothers were trying to comfort them, elderly shoppers were struggling to keep up with the orders being shouted in accented English. Among the hostages, Frank recognized faces he'd seen for years. Maria from the coffee shop, who always worked weekends, the Henderson family with their 3 young kids who came every Saturday to let the children play in the indoor playground, old Mr. Patterson, who walked the mall for exercise every afternoon because his doctor said it was good for his heart. These weren't just civilians to Frank. They were his people, his responsibility, his mission. The remaining 4 terrorists had formed a defensive perimeter around the hostages, weapons trained outward, expecting an assault from mall security or police tactical teams. What they didn't expect was a lone Marine who knew the building better than they knew their own equipment. Frank's approach was methodical, patient, professional. He'd learned long ago that rushing into a hostage situation was the fastest way to get innocent people killed. Instead, he used the mall's own infrastructure against his enemies, turning familiar spaces into tactical advantages. The 3rd terrorist went down when Frank dropped through a ceiling tile directly above him, using gravity and surprise to eliminate the threat before the man could react. The 4th fell victim to a carefully placed flashbang grenade that disoriented him long enough for Frank to close the distance and neutralize him with non-lethal force. That left 2 terrorists and nearly 200 hostages in an increasingly volatile situation. The leader was screaming now, his carefully planned operation falling apart around him. He pressed his rifle against the head of a young mother holding a baby, using her as a human shield while demanding to know who was attacking his team. "Show yourself," he shouted in heavily accented English. "I know you're watching. Come out or I start killing hostages." Frank emerged from behind a pillar, his hands empty and visible, moving slowly and deliberately. He looked like exactly what he appeared to be, a tired old janitor in work clothes, carrying nothing more threatening than a mop handle. "I'm here," Frank said quietly. "Let the people go. Your problem is with me." The terrorist leader studied him with confusion and growing rage. This wasn't what he'd expected. Not SWAT teams or negotiators, but a custodian who spoke with the calm authority of someone accustomed to dangerous situations. "You did this?" the terrorist demanded. "You killed my men?" "I stopped them from hurting innocent people," Frank replied. "Same thing I'm going to do to you." The terrorist's finger tightened on the trigger, but Frank was already moving. 25 years of civilian life hadn't dulled reflexes honed in the world's most dangerous places. He covered the distance between them in less than 2 seconds, using techniques learned in rooms that didn't officially exist to disarm and neutralize the threat without harming the hostage. The final terrorist, seeing his leader fall, tried to spray the crowd with automatic fire. But Frank was there too, intercepting the weapon's arc with his own body, taking a bullet in the shoulder while ensuring that every shot went into the ceiling instead of into innocent people. When it was over, 6 terrorists lay unconscious or dead on the mall floor, and 300 hostages were safe. Frank sat against the fountain, pressure on his shoulder wound, watching paramedics tend to the few civilians who'd been injured in the chaos. Police and federal agents swarmed the scene within minutes, trying to process what had happened. A mall custodian had single-handedly stopped a terrorist attack, saving hundreds of lives with nothing but improvised weapons and skills he'd learned in military service decades earlier. The questions came fast and furious. Who was he? How had he known what to do? Where had he learned to fight like that? Frank answered them with the same quiet professionalism he'd brought to his custodial duties. Yes, he'd served in the Marines. Yes, he'd been trained for situations like this. No, he didn't consider himself a hero. He'd just done what needed to be done to protect people who couldn't protect themselves. But the story was too big to contain. Within hours, news crews had descended on the mall, eager to interview the custodian who'd stopped a terrorist attack. Federal investigators were poring over his military records, trying to understand how a decorated Force Recon veteran had ended up mopping floors in suburban America. The photo behind the customer service desk, the one that had hung there for 25 years showing Employee of the Month awards, suddenly took on new meaning. That quiet janitor in the background of every photo wasn't just Frank the custodian. He was Gunnery Sergeant Morrison, decorated combat veteran, a warrior who'd spent a quarter-century standing guard over a place most people took for granted. When Frank returned to work a week later, his arm still in a sling from the gunshot wound, everything had changed. Store employees who'd barely acknowledged him for years now stopped to shake his hand and thank him. Parents pointed him out to their children as the man who'd kept them safe. Security guards who'd worked alongside him for decades looked at him with new respect and understanding. "Why didn't you ever tell us?" Marcus asked as they stood in the security office, looking at the monitors that showed Frank's handiwork being cleaned up by crime scene technicians. Frank was quiet for a long moment, watching custodial staff, his replacement crew, working to return the mall to normal. "Some things are better left in the past," he said finally. "I came here to forget about war, not to relive it. But you saved all those people." "I protected my territory," Frank replied simply. "Same thing I've been doing for 25 years, just more obvious this time." The mall reopened 3 days later with enhanced security measures and a small memorial plaque near the fountain where the attack had taken place. It didn't mention Frank by name, he'd specifically requested that it not, but simply read, "In honor of those who stand watch over others, seen and unseen." Frank Morrison continued working the night shift, arriving at 10 p.m. and leaving at 6 a.m., maintaining the same quiet professionalism he'd always shown. But now people knew who he really was and what he'd been willing to do to keep them safe. The red, white, and blue banner that the mall management hung near the main entrance didn't carry his name either. It simply said, "Thank you to our guardian," and everyone who saw it knew exactly who it meant. Sometimes heroes wear uniforms and carry weapons. Sometimes they carry mop buckets and work in the shadows, watching over people who never know they're being protected. Frank Morrison had been both kinds of hero, and in the end, that's all he'd ever wanted to be, someone who stood between good people and the darkness that threatened them. The mall was his territory, the people were his responsibility, and for 25 years, he'd never let them down. So now I ask you, have you ever met someone whose quiet strength protected you without you knowing it? Someone who stood guard while you lived your life in peace? Share their story in the comments below. Thank you for watching Faces Behind Stories. If this story moved you, subscribe to support the channel. We publish stories that matter, stories that remind us that heroes don't always announce themselves and that sometimes the most dangerous people are the ones who look the most ordinary. We'll see you in the next story. And remember, you never know who's watching over you.